Hi, this is Phil Newman from Longevity.Technology, and I'm delighted to say that I'm joined by the founder of Vitalia, Niklas Anzinger. How are you doing?
Great. Fantastic to be here, Phil.
Well, Nicholas, I'm very interested in what came out of Vitalia. I know that you started in January, right, with a 2-month project, pretty similar to the work that went on with Zuzulu, but now it's turned into a permanent district in a special economic zone in Honduras. So that's amazing work.
Yeah,
How
there's a
did that
lot to
happen?
yeah. Yeah, there's a lot to talk about there. I've been amazed myself how enormously successful it was, thanks to the amazing show up by the longevity community, most of all. So we had more than 500 people here. Aubrey was here almost the entire time. Brian Johnson, Naval Ravikant, Balaji Srinivasan. And the most important thing we wanted to prove with the first pop-up city was that we can see it's the seeding strategy for a permanent longevity biotech focused district, right? We didn't want it to be something like an entertainment for nomads or something like that. We wanted to show we can get people to build actual startups here. So I'm very happy to say at the final investor demo day, we had more than 30 startups pitching. About 60% of them were biotech. And now we have about, I'd say, 20, 25 people who are willing to move and to relocate here. And several companies are willing to pursue some of the options that we can do here for accelerated clinical trials and medical tourism. So that's
Mhm.
why we decided to double down on make this a permanent district that will have infrastructure, clinics, labs, and all of that.
Okay, fascinating. So, of those companies that you went through, and I guess went through a voting process or some sort of qualification process, you're now in the position where I understand it that you've got some of these assets are now moving into proper research, right? So, what's the stage of these? I mean, obviously they're preclinical, but I mean, what is the status of those, and what does the pipeline look like for new companies coming down the line?
Sure. I would say when it comes to the research, we're more piggybacking off of what's already existing, right? So the prime example that's often quoted is Minicircle, right? So they've developed a follistatin gene therapy that they did a clinical trial here for and do provide through medical tourism, but they've done the research before and they have their labs in Austin, right? So when it comes to the research itself, there's just not that much infrastructure yet. So our target group is really founders and scientists who have research that they'd like to bring to the world at an accelerated pace, right? Ideally, it is already proven through animal studies to be safe. Maybe it even has pre-existing human trials, right? We just need a faster pathway to market, right? It's not necessarily for it can be, but it's not necessarily for the most edgy stuff out there that's like unproven, right? A better
Mhm.
use case is actually the kinds of therapies or drugs that we know work, right? So we have a lot of data, and we're just not progressing fast enough, but we should be.
Well, let's talk about two things then. Let's talk about the classification of those assets that you're working on. And the thing that I'm most interested in is like, okay, so you're doing the work that you're doing now. You're in Honduras. The big markets where the needle is going to be moved is, developed economies. So how are you going to bridge that? How are you going to go from the preclinical work that's going on, doing a document pack that gets you to a grade of evidence that could be accepted into a larger regulated economic opportunity. How are you doing it? What's the bridging looking like?
Yeah. So the key thing to understand is the regulatory system and how it's different to the existing one, for example, the FDA, right? So the way it's currently done with the FDA is, 4 stages of clinical trials, safety and efficacy, and that takes currently about 10 plus years. We think that's too long. And we think it can get down significantly, right? We've seen that with the COVID vaccine and Operation Warp Speed. And we've also seen, and not many people know about this, 6 months was the norm before 1962, right? 1962 and the Kefauver-Harris amendments to the FDA's mandate. Basically, before the FDA had a deadline by Congress to approve a drugs in 6 months. And it wasn't like medical anarchy or something like that before. We
Right.
had amazing drugs and therapies that were developed before. We had penicillin, we had vaccines, we had all sorts of things, right? So we think we can go back to a standard that's more focused on the safety side, right? The
Hmm.
efficacy side, I would like to, in the future, unbundle, right? So proving efficacy is something that you could use in a variety of trials, right? It doesn't need to be, or it should be ideally for therapies that reach scale, a gold standard randomized control trial, of course. But in the meantime, Why should people not have the right to take drugs that are proven safe and that they assess their risk profile to be positive for them, right? Because
Okay.
there's a good chance that they die before it's approved within 10 years.
So let's talk about who those people are then, right? Because obviously we're very aware that the 0.1% are very engaged in their personal health and longevity. Understandably, who isn't as a human being? There's the 1% as well, which of course is the widening of the opportunity. But there are, as we all know, billions of people out there that could be benefiting from these therapeutics. And I was looking at Honduras's population pyramids, right? And it's not dissimilar to some of the more developed societies that are out there. Fewer babies coming through at the bottom, aging population at the top. So, is your home base of Honduras an avenue for you getting clinical approval, or are you going to take what you're doing in a kind of, let's say, offshore environment and trying to get it into a different regulatory regime?
Yeah. So it is an offshore environment, right? So, and right now it's mostly used by foreigners, right? Which isn't necessarily how we'd like to have it in the future. We'd like to open it up to Hondurans as well. It's just more like the looks of it, right? Doing experiments, on a local population or whatever, that wouldn't bode well for something like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the clinical trial participants and the ones doing medical tourism right now are predominantly American. Right, so that's an important thing to notice. And again, about the regulatory environment, it's different from Honduras, right? So the special economic zone that Prosperous under has autonomy in these kinds of business matters, or corporate law in
Okay.
general, for that matter.
Very okay. So let's understanding that. So I guess there's sort of tax implications and things like that in a kind of free zone. But does it mean that within that particular zone that you have, that there it's an unregulated environment, or is there some form of regulation? I guess so. I'm interested to understand that from a policy perspective, because people are speaking about this all over the world now, and they want to
Mm-hmm.
understand how we can accelerate these therapeutics. So, A, what's going on in Honduras, and then B, okay, how are you going to get it out of there into the next market?
Sure. Yeah. So it's a big misunderstanding and misconception that it's unregulated. It is a regulated environment, right? It is a common law based legal environment. So common law is basically similar in many ways to Dubai, to Singapore, to Hong Kong, right? And many economists explain the success of these economies with adopting common law as opposed to civil law. So civil law is very top down and common law is very bottom up. So it's built on like real world cases and it's less prescriptive. So it's more looking at concrete liabilities and harms done, right? So here, like anywhere, if you're frauding someone, if you're misrepresenting like evidence, if you give people something that is demonstrably you made false claims, that is punishable under criminal law here and under common law, under anything you could find, right? And in addition, we live in a world where the medical sector is regulated for good reasons, because there's risks to human life, the human body, and even to unconsenting third parties. So businesses here want to adopt regulation to be able to show also other jurisdictions, hey, what I'm doing here is legit, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the interesting thing here is that you can choose regulations that you think fit your business, right? So it's not that every business is under the same regulations. You can choose what you're under. And what is pre-approved is, for example, OECD regulations. So you can say my clinical trials or my clinic is under Norwegian law, and another clinic can say it's under German law. And if this doesn't go far enough for you, you can even get a custom regulatory option. If you say I want a bit of Germany, a bit of Norway, and I have some new ideas, in
Mm-hmm.
which case it's subject to approval by a Prosper Council. And very importantly, you need mandatory liability insurance. Right.
Okay.
And the idea is that puts the insurer in the position of a regulator, right?
And are there insurers that will take that risk?
Yeah. So right now there's basically one insurer, which is the by default the Prosper Insurance, but there is some other providers popping up, right? So it
Okay.
is an important piece to get this right, that we have a competitive insurance market for sure. But once we make that work, the idea is that we correctly price in the risk, right? We're not over-regulating, because this way the insurers would have too high compliance costs in a competitive market, but we're
Yeah.
also not under-regulating, right? Otherwise the insurers would have to pay.
So that's really very, very interesting. So how does this go from what stage are you going up to IND, or are you going to phase two? What is the destination that you have for saying, okay, we've done what we can here. We're now going to move this on into a new jurisdiction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the IND process exists. It's just basically easier, right? So right now it takes, you need to pay 150,000 for a meeting, right, to get an IND approval, right? So that's just a bureaucratic cost that we can cut here, right? So it's just really the simplicity of working with sort of a customer-friendly startup as opposed to a large monolithic organization, right? That you actually have someone you can talk to and you can make the arguments, hey, this is already very well proven through studies XYZ. So that kind of IND approval or IRB for that matter can be just done much faster, and you can save a lot of costs there. But it should have, depending on what it is, of course, should have credible evidence that this is safe, right? Otherwise, you shouldn't go to safety trials. And then,
sorry, please carry on. I don't want to interrupt you because this is very interesting.
Yeah, sure. And then I'm saying, so we have a case study of one right now with the mini circle safety trials, right? And it's probably feasible to also do phase 2. Right. And then afterwards, it might make more sense at this point before there's a larger build out of the infrastructure here to go to other jurisdictions. And there's a lot to say about that, how that could look like.
Yeah, I guess there's a lot, but I mean, let's say you're in phase 2, so obviously you've gone through your human safety and you're now looking at efficacy. So those patient populations would effectively be tourists, would you say?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So that's very interesting. So would you say that once you've got to a stage of phase 2 readouts and you're going, right, okay, this is very interesting. Now we have a therapeutic. That's traditionally where big pharma gets involved, right? And obviously, we know that big pharma is interested in what's happening in this space now. But obviously, big pharma is only going to be really interested when you're looking to translate this into multi-million populations. So do you have that in your roadmap now as to how you're going to bridge over that, or is that kind of a bit further down the line you'll work it out?
Yeah. So there's 2 pathways, right? And we're basically now pursuing these pathways, but we can't yet say, so the one pathway is the clinical and the research pathway, right? So in an ideal world, so MiniCircle and other companies that did phase 1 safety trials or even phase 2 trials go to other jurisdictions, ideally at some point also the FDA, and say, hey, we accept these offshore trials, which is not unusual, right? So Australia is known for cheaper offshore trials.
Yep.
And then that basically gives us legitimacy, and that would immediately like 10x everything we're doing here, which is very good, right? So we want that. And so we want to prove, hey, what we're doing here can be accepted elsewhere, right?
Yeah.
I wouldn't necessarily bet in the short term that the FDA is going to say that. That might be a challenge longer term or take some years, but we want to set up ourselves for that kind of success, right? And in the meantime, companies that do phase 1 trials here, they also shopping around in other jurisdictions to do phase 2 trials or to also get access in terms of approvals. So I'm hearing about jurisdictions like Costa Rica, like Mexico, like Dubai, or like Japan. So Dubai especially, I think I would have high hopes for, because from visits there, they seem to me very innovative there on that side. And they're also basically have a similar model as we have here as Prospera, right? So Dubai is basically 40 different special economic zones. And 3 or 4 of them have ambitions, especially when it comes to the medical sector, right? So they're very open to these ideas there.
Mm-hmm. So I mean, if I was a CEO of a biotech or CSO looking to really accelerate my program, are you looking at your internal community? Because it feels to me like you've obviously got a vibe going on between innovators, people that are looking at extended lifespans, maybe extreme extended lifespans. So kind of like I'm going to say the word like a population or a commune of people that are kind of believers in some way. But you're looking to make this into a much more serious business model that's taking on, the pathways of large biotech. So how do you bridge that? I mean, is the vibe still, from those days of Vitalia, and now are you professionalizing, and are you looking for people to come now to you to actually run their trials?
Yeah, I don't see that necessarily as a contradiction, right? I see many of the startups that aren't necessarily yet big biotechs. They're often like the leaders in their field, right? They got some of the best scientists that are really at the frontier of what they're working on. So I don't really think that's a contradiction, right? So, and that coupled with sort of many experts that we brought for the conferences here, like we got the who's who really in the longevity community on the science side to come here. So there is a very strong component of vetting and of building credibility, right? So, and that's what we want, right? We want to build a standard here that can be accepted anywhere in the world. And that is sort of driven by rigor, but at the same time also by the kind of insights that we really need to accelerate, and that it is that there's an important moral dimension to let people do or give people a bigger sense of medical freedom, right? So people should be able to assess risks on their own to a greater extent than they currently can.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't disagree with that. I guess it's kind of the view I have of the industry, of course, is from both ends. So you can see the macro side as well as the accelerated side that everybody wants from it. But maybe let's just talk about the infrastructure then, because you mentioned that you've got clinics, you've
Mhm.
got obviously the infrastructure for doing trials. So are you building out lab space and building out the infrastructure so you can kind of go from lab to clinic all the way through?
Yeah, so we're not building out the lab infrastructure yet. We would like to. So if you'd like to partner with us, if you have capital, if you want to build real estate here, it's also both Prospera and we are in fundraising processes. So that we definitely want to do. And the idea is that we really build around the demand of the community here, right? So right now you can already do the medical tourism and the trials. And what can we do to make it more sticky? Right, so to allow the companies, the people here to spend more time here, to do more, to create more of the value add that they right now would do elsewhere. So the lab, for example, to do that here.
And what type of therapeutics are you looking at? You mentioned obviously stem cells. Are you looking at xenotherapeutics, cellular reprogramming? Is the whole gamut of longevity biotech?
Yeah. So my background isn't in the science, right? So I'm only here. I'm telling you what I'm picking up from people, what seems to be a lot of traction around. So the stem cell side is kind of already ongoing, right? So the GARM clinic, which is the one where the clinical trials are done and who has the IRB, they came to Roatán in 2014. Right, so that was before Prospera. They were a clinic focused on like stem cells and tissue repair and all of that. What seems to be right now a very good use case is gene therapy. So what MiniCircle has been trialing, and there's some other companies, for example, Unlimited Bio, that are also going into gene therapy, and that would make a lot of sense, right? Because there's an enormous promise and potential of gene therapies. They're currently very expensive, the ones that are approved, like they go into the millions, where MiniCircle's therapy costs 25,000. And also, I think gene therapy seems to me to exemplify kind of what's wrong with the regulatory model of the FDA, right? Because
Hmm.
it's done for small molecules, right? So it proves it really is for per use case. Whereas in the case of gene therapy, and there's even drafts by the FDA themselves that they might want to change that to instead regulate gene therapy as a platform. Sort of the risk profile really is in the viral vector, less in the payload or less in like the specific use case that you use it for. So I think
Hmm.
that would make a lot of sense to say, hey, this is really the blockbuster use case that we could build a lot around. So from what I'm hearing, but we also want this to make it in a way so like the best scientists and entrepreneurs in the world who are really at the frontiers of that can sort of find what they're looking for within the kind of reason that the legal framework provides to, well, save people's lives.
Yeah, and I mean I know the vibe, but all of these events is a crossover between the crypto community and the biotech community, and crypto people are probably a little less patient perhaps than some people in the biospace, so they're expecting their returns quicker and so on. So, do you see that there is going to be those crypto wealthy people that are going to be supporting these programs so that not only they can see the science go forward, but perhaps benefit themselves?
Yeah, I mean that's already happening, but it's not like a pure crypto play, right? So most of the companies that are here are traditional Delaware companies and do many of their operations also in fiat currency, right? So most of us are very attracted to crypto, and we're trying to integrate it where we can, and I think it has a lot of advantages. Witness also the involvement from Vitalia, which is building out these the rails or the allowing the crypto community to invest in this kind of research, which is a very good thing. In practice, that's not the whole story, right? So in practice, we're very much also looking to the traditional ways of doing things, because that's what much of biotech and bioscience is, really going into the lab and doing the science and getting it into humans in ways that we need sort of the experience that has accumulated over hundreds of years to do, right? But at the same time, the crypto community, I think, has an ethos that is very aligned with the idea of acceleration and of the sort of the medical freedom aspect of it. So I think that is very aligned. But at the same time, many of the guardrails against some of the risks that come with it are also correct, right? So we are aiming to bridge exactly that gap. And to me,
Yeah.
it seems the crypto community is very open to that and sees that as very legitimate, right? So nobody is not afraid of taking drugs that are unproven, right? So anyone wants to know, is this thing safe if I take it?
So, well, I mean, obviously, Niklas, so you've answered the questions that I had in my mind very, very well. I guess the thing is moving on to the next steps, right? So you've got your next round of events happening in the summer, and presumably, look, what you're trying to do is to build a not a transient community, but a stable community from where you are geographically now.
Yeah, exactly. It is a beautiful place, by the way, if I may mention that. It's a tropical paradise, right? So I've been here for 2 years and organizing conferences. And when people hear Honduras, they kind of associate it with crime and corruption. And that's true for mainland. But there's lots to be say how much of a positive impact this project can have on Honduras as a whole. But Roatán is an island that's off the mainland, and it's in many ways separate, both culturally and in terms of infrastructure, right? So it has a higher state of development. It has a developed tourism economy. It's got 1.2 million tourists each year, many of which are coming from cruise ships and are on the wealthy and older side. So they have a high need and willingness to get such treatments. So it's a lot of advantages. And also Roatan is predominantly English speaking. Right, so these are all like very strong built-in advantages of this location. It's a 2.5 hour direct flight from Miami, Dallas, and Houston, right?
Well, I mean, Nicholas, it sounds like a very exciting project, and of course, you've got a busy summer coming up. So, really appreciate you sharing some of that insight with us today, and really, thanks for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Really great. Thanks for having me on so much, Phil.